But here's the interesting part. You just took the attitude of Russia. And Russia, on an international level, they missed the last Olympics because of steroids. And right. What they determined was statewide endorsed use of steroids. And they look at it just like you. I'm not being allowed to use all the tools possible. How can we not use science to enhance what we do here? And then you get into all the ethics and stuff. But here's the other part of it, and this is the part where we can bring history in as well and stuff, is that the bottom line is it's always going to be there. People are always going to look for an advantage. So now, on a worldwide level, internationally, policing it is absolutely impossible. And that's the part that you just have to be realistic. So now, anything that you're throwing at this to police it is just a little boy with his finger in the dam. You're just hoping to catch a guy or two so you can. I caught Jon Jones. Holy mackerel! We can make news. The beta testing and everybody's on beta testing and everything is good. And UFC sits there and goes, "Huh? We got 600 guys on the roster and they're busting one or two. We're looking pretty good." So it's a structure there. But how does it actually work at an international level when you have the UFC going to Russia, where they set up clinics with FBI equivalent, the FSB agents, in place of doctors to collect urine and stuff, to hide Russian urine samples or blood samples or whatever it was. Just doctors replaced by agents of the government in order to fake it. This is what the commissions found and why Russia was banned. Now, I think this week, Russia is now allowed back in the Olympics next time, and they've done whatever they do to clean up, which I imagine is just throw money, But so they threw money at the Olympic commissions, and now they're back in. And that's the thing is how do you police? How do you police it when you have a state that says, our guys are better that way?
Well, and my argument is more than just how do you police it, but why police it at all? The fact is, I want my athletes to perform at their absolute best. As an athlete, I know for a fact, especially an aging athlete who's had a car accident a couple of years ago and everything else, that without the use of performance-enhancing drugs, there's absolutely no way I could come back and be even modestly competitive at this point. Not that I'm concerned about that, but imagine if I was 32 years old and wanted to make that one last run at it, but I'd had a couple of injuries. Why not allow a guy to use performance-enhancing drugs to recover? If they want to do that, they could say, okay, we can put some kind of time limit on it or some kind of a, if it's prescribed, and then everybody would get around that. So the idea of trying to police it, to me, seems absurd. It steals from the fans, and it doesn't allow us to have the fullest, biggest kind of competition that we could have. And I point back to the days of Pride, because there wasn't a guy in Pride who wasn't taking some type of performance-enhancing drug at that point. I'm sure there probably were. That's not fair. But, you look at the Alistair Overeem from Pride versus the Alistair Overeem now. Okay, the guy eats horse meat. That's great. But that's not going to explain how he looked that way. And what did we get in Pride? We saw the best of the best, and the argument was, let Americans come to Japan and fight, and we'll see what it looks like. And it was kind of a 50-50 thing, but most of the times it worked out more in Pride's favor. Now, when it was switched and suddenly it was in a cage, people said, well, it's in a cage and they can't kick in the face and they can't wear shoes and there are all kind, and there were elbows, and so there were a lot of different arguments about it. But the bottom line is that the main argument was they were on juice, now they're not, and they all got destroyed, which kind of proves my point that, hey, if they're that much better on juice, then let's let them go ahead and be on it so the fans get the best out of it and the fighters get the best out of it, because ultimately it's more healthy for them. It allows them to recover more quickly. There's a lot of science that suggests that what I'm saying is true. I'm sure you could find 100 counter arguments to it, but I could certainly pull up a lot of empirical research that states otherwise. So
that's the problem with it, and that's where, just to begin the argument of policing, start with this: what is a steroid? You tell me, what's a steroid? A performance.
Okay, what is a steroid? Is testosterone a steroid? Does it have to be an androgen? Does it have to be in an ester? At what point do you say it is or is not?
Talk about it in the simplest terms. What's a PED? What is a performance-enhancing drug for the purpose of this conversation? Steroids, the loose term for that.
Well, one could consider caffeine to be a performance-enhancing drug.
Here's and you're getting to my point. The point is it's not a steroid. It's not an illegal item until somebody's put it on a list.
Right.
And so at the end of the day, there's always going to be things that are not on the list. There's always going to be things covered that are not on the list. So there's going to be things that maybe under our parameters now should have been on the list, like for example creatine, but isn't on the list. It's considered over, and it befuddles me how you could be in a situation where the pro fighters are like, I tested positive, yeah, but I bought it at GNC, so the government of the list is what really determines whether you're going to test positive or not. Now this is absolutely the essential part of the problem. You can't define this stuff, So, for example, Nick Diaz in MMA. Nick Diaz, I think, is a pretty well documented example that went and had his bone actually shaved down a little bit because it protruded a little bit, and it had a tendency to scar and to bleed and stuff. So he actually had shaved down. Now, is that a performance enhancing what? It's a performance enhancing something because it's preventing him from bleeding, but it's not a drug that you find in the blood, so there's nothing anyone can do about it.
But it most certainly enhanced his body in some way to allow him to get through a fight with less scarring, with less cutting, and so one has to ask: is that fair?
Yeah, that's the point. Is at what point is something that was at one point medical enhancement, Leonard came back in boxing, because he had his retina reattached, and people were like, no way you can do it. But the point is he had his retina reattached. How many Harry Greb died with his retina unattached because nobody could attach it in the 20s?
Okay, so that brings us up to where are we at in science as far as what can we consider to be performance enhancing and what isn't. So now we get to stem cells, which right now are being handed out like lemonade. TJ Dillashaw was just not very long ago, he was online talking about, hey, I just had my shoulder taken care of, it feels great, got some stem cell injections, everything's awesome. So, and as somebody who knows an awful lot about stem cells based on life circumstances, I can tell you that stem cell use is at some point going to have to be addressed as, is this the same thing? Because what does a steroid do? Okay, so what does testosterone do besides make you have big muscles and go fast? The main thing that testosterone really does is it allows you to recover more quickly. Well, what do you think stem cells do? They allow you to recover more quickly. And we haven't even started to talk about things like CRISPR and Cas9. Once we start getting into gene editing, we're in a wholly different world where nothing is as it seems.
I was going to say, you're right there at the point of history where, there could be science involvement at a level that you're never going to see before. I remember as a kid reading like an old graphic novel of, I think it was called Super Boxers, and it was guys that were kind of like they put on a suit or they'd fight, and enhancements were like things like bionics and things like that were going on. I may be mixing up the story, but we're getting close to that in many ways, shape, or form. But keep in mind, like just in the record of what we know, from the 20s, from the 1910s, there are boxers looking for an edge one way, shape, or form. I'm confident that boxers fought on cocaine. And the bottom line is cocaine wasn't illegal to a certain point in the United States. And these guys were looking for any type of edge. There are stories of boxers, coming up and taking a shot of whiskey. That'll wake you up. That'll get the blood flowing a little bit. But things that you just because of doctors and ethics and things like that, we wouldn't even do. But in the raw moment, these in the old days, those types of things happen. So now that comes down to a little bottle of water with a little magic formula from wherever you get it, because that's the bottom line. Is you take the example of Alexander Povetkin. Povetkin's fighting for a world championship in boxing this weekend, and he's a guy who's tested a couple of times for a drug that he tested positive because he was doing it while it was legal, and then he got put on the list. And then afterwards, he said, "Hey, it's from back then and stuff." And he tested positive for it again, but that's the kind of problem with these guys. Plus, on top of it, how do you tell them, "Oh, no, that you can't do anymore because it's now illegal"? It's been legal the whole time because nobody put it on the list. This is the same drug that the tennis star Sharapova was accused of doing.
Yeah. And here's. In the late '90s, early aughts, they started to come out with these kind of GNC sort of drugs that were legal, and they were called 6-sided steroids. So a steroid in general has 5 sides to it, chemically speaking, with your covalent bonding. But this was a 6-sided steroid, and they actually called it D-ball. But instead of it being a Diana-ball, it was D and a B-A-L-L ball. And so they were clearly marketing as what it was. And when you took it, and I've taken both, the effects they weren't as drastic and dramatic as taking Dianabol, but it wasn't that far off from it, I can assure you of that. And it was certainly, most definitely, performance enhancing. And everybody in the gym was taking that stuff because they were selling it over the counter. And suddenly you saw everybody in this one particular gym in town grow like crazy, and they were huge, and they were performing better, they were faster, these guys weren't getting injured as much, other than they had some muscle tears when they backed off the creatine. That went away. But the idea is that when do we stop deciding that we're going to tell people how to live their lives and just let the sport be the sport? We have rules put in place. We know what the rules are. Leave it alone and let them fight, and whatever it takes them to recover. And I believe this should be indicative of football, basketball, any sport. Any time that there is a professional payday, then they should be able to do whatever they need to do to feed their family, to be successful. And I, as a fan, want that. For one thing, I don't want to find out that a guy tears his knee 6 weeks out, and he could have taken juice and probably healed from it fast enough to have made the fight and still had a fight. How many fights have been scrapped because somebody tested positive for something stupid like even marijuana? I mean, something idiotic like that. Diaz has got a lifetime suspension, and I know that's all being worked out, but the fact that Diaz ever got a lifetime suspension for marijuana is just absolutely absurd. It's absurd ad nauseum, and until USADA backs off and the UFC kind of grows a pair and decides that they're going to say, you know what, maybe we're using the wrong group for this, and maybe we need to back it down a little bit and decide this is a little too much. It infringes on people's rights and on their ability to live their lives the way that they choose to. Can you imagine being awakened at 4 o'clock in the morning to have a guy go, "I need to see you hold your penis in your hand while you do this"? The whole Vanderlei Silva thing was that a guy showed up and asked him to step into a janitor's closet and pee in a bottle, and he didn't even have any proof of who he was. And that was, that is Vanderlei's version of the story. I understand that. But nonetheless, there's something funky going on there nonetheless. We can agree on that, right? So
there's nothing to disagree upon. Here's the absurdity of that. And you can take the Jose Aldo situation too. Okay? So Veda and the UFC, I don't know, somebody's covering fees here, right? Because Veda and the UFC sent the guy to Brazil, so that's about $1,000 plane ticket, 3, 4, 5 nights worth of hotels, food, per diem and stuff. The guy's got to go down there and represent, so he's probably got a suit and look good. So that's probably about $3,000 right there. So does that come out of Andy Silver's purse? You know, who's covering that? So that's the number one thing, is the number of expenditures. So now you have a guy who goes down there and, you know, in the most, you know, unbelievable expression of how rookie the whole situation is, he has the guy to step into a closet and pee for him. Then, you know, then all of a sudden, how do you address this? It's like, well, you probably need 2 or 3 people there. You know, you probably need a guy to do the talking, a couple of medical guys to put the gloves on and actually, you know, hold, you know, juggle, you know, get the whole PP out and do everything they need to do. Blah, blah, blah. So now you need 2 or 3 guys. Now you're at about $8,000. Take it out of Mandalorian's purse, no problem. Making a lot of money. But now, how do you do that at a smaller level? You can't. So there's, you know, essentially the absurdity of it. So now, oh, what is the solution? You throw people at it. So there's been stories, like, for example, so I paid the guy because Veda counts on volunteers. So who the fuck is going to volunteer in Russia? People, you know, people from Russia, people who are already part of the system. So you could fly guys there. You could fly a guy to a fight in Russia and have the guy go into the janitor's closet and get the juggling going and get the little pee-pee in the cup and take it. And at some point, now you're still talking about, essentially, it's a medical procedure, right? So what happens there? The guy can't take it back to his hotel room. What's he going to do? Put the piss back in the fridge, in the mini fridge at the hotel? Keep it on lock? No. He's got to give it to a lab to hold, you know, in one of those white boxes with the labels and stuff like that. That's got to go to a lab in Russia, where they had FSB agents take over the lab. So in this case, they don't need an FSB agent to take over the lab. They just need 3 of them to show up at the door and go, you know what? Hand the piss over. So the police
and here's
is absurd.